Stirring the coffee with chopsticks using the board. Take two. Stirring the coffee. Take three. Stirring the coffee with chopsticks using the vortex method, the only true way to optimize the taste of your coffee at the molecular level. Good morning. Welcome to the Daybreak Show. I am the Sultan. We'll get started, but first, Jack Daniel's whiskey coffee. I'll put a link for it down below, but here's my first sip. We'll see how this is. Ooh, that's good. Excuse me one second. Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I bought my father a couple bags of Jim Beam bourbon coffee. He loved it. And then last week I sent him and my mom a box of Cask Coffee Company K-Cups, because they have a Keurig coffee machine. And there's like rye whiskey, bourbon, like different kind of coffees, and it's like an assortment. And I called after they got it, a day after, and they liked it. And I have for lack of a better term, a whiskey family. We like whiskey and bourbon. Very strange. My great-grandfather died of alcohol poisoning. And so alcoholism runs in my family, but I guess you never know you have it until you try it, right? Not try alcoholism, until you try alcohol. You know, out of 100 people that drink, that enjoy a cocktail, you know, I don't know what the percentage is. 1 or 2 are just not going to be able to handle it. So being a whiskey family, we enjoy old fashions and Manhattans and whiskey and bourbon, scotch on the rocks, that kind of thing. Everybody but Tony. Tony is not a whiskey guy. You guys know Tony. He's not a whiskey guy. All that being said, oh, this is a funny story. I'm probably 16, 17 years old. I just got my driver's license. I go to see my grandparents, drive about 40 minutes to go see them. And my grandfather says, "Would you like some coffee?" I said, "Sure." So he's making coffee. I go in the kitchen, and as he's pouring my coffee, he opens up the cupboard, pulls out a bottle of bourbon, takes the top off, looks at me and goes, like that, and pours some in the coffee, puts the bottle back, and then he hands it to me. Okay, this was in the day where you could give a kid a sip of your alcohol, or like I remember as a little boy, "Dad, can I have a sip of your beer?" And I would take a sip of his beer in a bar. Now you got to remember, I grew up going to bars with my father. This was when you could go to a kid. My father would take me to a bar. I'd sit at the end of the bar at the VFW, and I remember a couple other bars. And I'll never forget, I'd get a bag of Wise potato chips, a little bag of beer nuts. Remember beer nuts? Remember those? And the bartender would always give me a little, like a shot glass with beer in it. Like this much. A shot glass, not even an ounce. And then like a glass of root beer, while my dad was doing his thing. So the bartender was my babysitter, so to speak. So I grew up in bars. Fortunately and unfortunately, but I'll say fortunately because I was wise to the world. Not that that's not in the good parent handbook, but I wouldn't trade it for anything, to be honest with you. So back to whiskey. My grandfather says, "Shh," and puts bourbon in my coffee. And I said, "Wow, that really tastes good." And he looks at me and goes, like that. And he wasn't an alcoholic or anything like that. He was a guy that enjoyed a good cocktail. Was not a wine drinker. I don't think I ever saw my grandfather drink wine. It was always some kind of whiskey drink. I remember like orange peels twisted and put in the drink. And then I remember the men eating like the pickled, are they pickled orange peels? But they would eat It was like a slice of an orange and then twisted and put in the drink. But they would eat it. And I developed my taste for whiskey probably at about 5 or 6 years old. Very strange, I know. But I'm not an alcoholic, you know. I'm not the 1 out of 100 that found out the hard way. But you never know when you order something, if it's like whiskey flavored, if it's like some whiskey thing made in a laboratory or something. This actually says made with authentic Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey. It tastes like there's whiskey in it. It smells like there's whiskey in it. And when I say whiskey, there's people that are going to be like, you're confusing the feel of whiskey in your mouth and throat with the taste. Like if you ever had whiskey or bourbon or scotch, it burned. You know, Dennis Leary, everyone makes the whiskey face. Find that comedy routine with Dennis Leary when he talks about the one guy sitting at the bar who's got the whiskey face. Everyone who does the shot does this kind of like look. And then that's why you need to like drink beer to wash that down your throat. It's funny. But if you can separate the feeling of whiskey, the burning in your mouth, separate that from the taste of it, it really is nice. Now, Jack Daniel's, of course, is made in barrels that have been burned on the inside. They char the barrels. So you get this smoky, almost, you don't get the strong peat taste like you would with scotch, but you get the smoky and you get that vanilla, that aromatic vanilla. Like when I just took a sip of this, obviously I'm tasting the coffee, but I get a little bit of the smoky and a little bit of the vanilla vapors rising up through my sinuses, and that makes it kind of nice. I'm really digging it. Here I am at 5 o'clock in the morning drinking Jack Daniel's flavored coffee. And I'm okay with that. So yeah, I'll put a link for this down below, or you can get it. I got this at Walmart. So if you have a Walmart near you, it's nice. And yes, I will get that again. Nothing in the rule book that says the red pill has to be bitter or you choke on it. A man's life needs a few luxuries that are exclusively his, not to impress or attract women, but for self-enjoyment and sharing with good friends. And that is my friend, John Hoover, that said that. Totally blew his confidentiality with that one. Sorry, John. He sent that to me in a private message. I usually don't repost anything that somebody sends me privately. I never do that, unless someone says this is okay to share. But that was one of his responses in an email that he sent to me. And I just thought it was so worth telling you. Thank you, John. Good stuff. And I'm glad we met. Thank you, John. Definitely. I know John only from Twitter and YouTube. That's it. Never met in person. But, and we did an interview. I think we did 1 or 2 interviews. We did one interview and we did a talk on the phone, like a Skype kind of thing. And you kind of know when somebody could be a friend in real life. You know what I'm talking about? Like when you meet people online and you're just shooting the breeze with them online. Like, let me just think about a few people that I communicate with on a fairly regular basis online. Like Phil from Briar Report. Honestly, I think Phil feels like a neighbor to me. It seems like he lives right there. And I could be sitting out back with him in his backyard, or he could be back here on my deck with me, and we're smoking a pipe and talking. Phil is a watchmaker, a horologist. I believe he gets up at midnight I think he gets up at midnight. I think he sleeps in the evening, gets up at midnight, and starts his work after midnight. Talk about interesting hours. And then, of course, I'm scratching my head going, I wonder if I could do that. And another guy that seems like a neighbor to me, Jeff Putnam from Rugged Legacy Guy Products, beard balms, beard oils, different kinds of products like that. Good dude that I could have a pipe with, have a cigar with. Met him for the first time at the 21 convention, and he calls me his real father. That's kind of funny. If you're not getting the Briar Report newsletter, just get on the mailing list. Go to Briar Report and get on the mailing list. Do yourself a favor. You see me, I have the Briar Report BRTV coffee mug sometimes. And there are people who I will retweet, or people that I've had on this channel that I've interviewed. Most of the people that I have interviewed usually end up being friends somehow, some way. True story. You remember my story with Coach Greg Adams. We took some shots at each other via social media. And you know this story. And then we worked it out. Phone calls, chatted, texted, and then met in person. I like the guy. And we had a great interview. I don't even like to call my interviews interviews. I like to call them conversations, because it's less, it sounds less, doesn't sound like interrogation or gotcha journalism. My journalism is asking deep questions and shutting up and being quiet and letting them talk, because my conversation shows are about my guest, not about me and how smart I am and how great of a question I can ask. My goal is that you get to know my guests. And most of the people that I've had those video conversations with end up being on my friend list at a, when you take a look at the scale of friend of 1 to 10, they end up on that 1 to 10 scale, whether being 1, like an acquaintance who is somebody I trust, all the way up to being a friend. Going out to dinner with, meeting them, doing something, meeting their family, that kind of thing. So that's where I'm at with that. I need to repeat this. It's very urgent. Whoever's been in contact with me in any way over the past 14 days, you need to stay indoors and contact your nearest test center. I'm very sorry. I've been diagnosed with being extremely sexy, and there's no treatment or vaccine. So again, I apologize. Women who don't send their men alluring selfies occasionally don't understand men. I didn't say sexual selfies. I said alluring. Now, if you want to send something sexy, go for it. But I said alluring. You define what that is for you. And your man wants you to. But he's afraid to tell you, because he's afraid you're going to think he's a pervert. You know what? You send him a selfie. Stoke those fires. I grew up in a home that we heated with a wood stove. And you would load the stove up at night, and you would close the flue a little bit to not let all the heat escape through the chimney. You wood burning stove and fireplace people know about this, but wood stoves are different than fireplaces. It's a whole different game. And you could control the heat in the house literally by the flue. If you just allow all the heat to go up the chimney, then the wood burns fast. You could load up the stove, close the flue just enough where the heat would be unbearable if you stood next to it. You could actually close the flue to the point where the wood stove would glow red, and you certainly didn't want to do that. So you'd learn the art of closing the flue in such a way where you would maximize the heat, but also minimize the threat of fire in the house. Ladies, you have your hand on the flue of how hot that relationship gets. You hold that. You have been given that wonderful privilege. Use it. And I didn't say send a, put your phone down in your crotch and send a spread eagle shot to your husband. Because he'd be like, what the heck? Maybe not. I don't know. I don't know your husband. But the reality is, you can turn the heat up between you and him. Men aren't real good at turning the heat up. You know what men are like? Men are like, here's the furnace, on, off. Men are like a heater, on, off. Women, you got the thermostat going on. That's the unique thing about the female gender versus the male gender. You have the thermostat. You can turn it up a little bit. One of the best pieces of advice was from an elder at a church I used to attend, Church of the Savior in Wayne, Pennsylvania. One of the elders, I don't know if he's still alive. He might be. I should reach out to him. Such a good guy. I used to meet him for breakfast. You know, when I talk about like men's ministries, that was one men's ministry that I actually did like. And I was a young man and not long out of college. And I remember to me, like I have like these little nuggets of wisdom. Like some of you will grab onto my wisdom, one nugget, and it will carry you for years. Like the pastor back when I was in my 20s, and I was just like a raging gorilla, a sexually raging gorilla. And I said to the pastor, when does this end? He said, when you die. Gee, thanks. But Bill Shore said to me, he says, remember this about women and men. He says, men are like a light switch, on, off, on, off. Women are like an iron. You have to plug them in, and then it takes a while for the iron to get hot. He says, and then when you're done ironing, it takes a while for the iron to cool off. He says, remember that, and you will always succeed with the opposite sex. I love stuff like that. But that's the kind of advice. Who's going to tell you that these days? I'm from the generation where men would give little maxims like that. Like one little nugget, and expect a young man to like live by that thing. Like in the movie The Graduate. You remember The Graduate with Dustin Hoffman? Okay? There was an era when men would talk to young men and say things that were significant, and they expected that young man to carry that nugget forever. Do you remember the piece of advice that was given to Dustin Hoffman at the end of the movie The Graduate? If you remember that, put it down below, if you know what I'm talking about. In 1973, the Chinese Mao regime killed 64 million of its citizens. Did you hear me? 64 million of their own citizens. China killed 64 million of their own people. Not only were they at war with the world, but they killed their own. Who opposed or reportedly spoke against the government. 64 million. You don't hear too much about 64 million, do you? You hear a lot about other atrocities and genocides. But you don't hear much about the 64 million Chinese citizens who were killed. I guess they're not, Chinese are not worth it, are they? That's insignificant. Get out of here with your 64 million. I'd rather focus on something else. Get out. Nothing to see here. Also, intelligence reports found that the majority of heroin in the 60s and 70s came from China. China's been waging war on the United States for a long time. We finally now have a president that's on to them and not making deals with them. Use your reals, not your feels, when dealing with politics. Okay? I have a friend who's a nun. She's like a sister to me. Some of you just got that. Others, right over your head. I actually have friends that are nuns. Believe it or not. When I was in my 20s, I worked with a gal who went to Immaculata College, which is now, I think, Immaculata University. And her two friends became nuns. Like she studied to be a therapist, and her two friends were educators, but they went into the convent. They went into the life right after college. And I think one left because she was a lesbian, or she was forced to leave the sisterhood or something like that. I don't know. I didn't judge her. I loved her. And the other one left, dated a friend of mine for a short time, was teaching, and then she went back into the sisterhood. Am I using the right term, sisterhood? So yes, I know nuns. And I loved them. I was going to say I loved them like sisters. That's weird. You know what's weird is when you, and probably I should interview them. Think about this for a second. Think about this for a second. You have a friend that you do stuff with. You go out to pubs, watch bands, okay? You know them. They go to a convent, and then when they finish their training and whatever nuns do, they come out. So Lisa became Sister Lisa. So now she's Sister Lisa. Interesting, right? That's trippy thinking about that. My old man's drunker than a barrel full of monkeys, and my old lady, she don't care. My sister looks cute in her braces and boots, a handful of grease in her hair. Elton John, 1973. Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting. Good song. Last year, 2019. 2020 has sucked for movies, except for Netflix and Amazon. 2019, my two favorite films. I'll just say my three favorite films. 2018, let's go back. 2018, my favorite film was, and it was also my favorite horror film, was Hereditary. Loved it. Absolutely loved it. Just so well done. 2019, I enjoyed Midsummer. It was number 3. Number 2 was Elton John, Rocket Man. And number 1 was Tolkien, which if you haven't seen Tolkien or Rocket Man, do so. Rocket Man, people say, you watched a movie about Elton John? Yes, it was one of the most creative movies I've ever seen in my life. It was done so well. It was so good. And the man that played Elton John was phenomenal. If you haven't seen Rocket Man, see it. I'm not going to say anything about it. And if you did see it, tell me what you thought about it. Some people tried to compare it to the Freddie Mercury movie, which there's no comparison. Rocket Man was way better than that. But my favorite movie of 2019 was Tolkien, which I absolutely, absolutely loved. Loved, loved, loved.
Form a club, a brotherhood. Change the world through the power of art. Music, poetry. And what about Tolkien? I want to write something. War! England's at war!
Well, I have to tell you, Mr. Tolkien, I've never come across anything like it.
This is more than just a friendship. It's an alliance. An invincible fellowship.
"2020 has pretty much sucked. I'm a theater goer. I'm not just an Amazon or Netflix guy. I like theaters. I love going to theaters. That's one of the things I like to do. And I go to matinees or the early showing. because it's usually me and maybe 2 other people in the theater. But if you get a chance, see Rocket Man. You'll like it. And with that, finish your coffee, your Jack Daniel's whiskey coffee. And I'll see you Monday morning on the Daybreak Show, your home of sanity, clarity, and reason